The Carathian Empire stretched across 17 star systems, its dark ships moving like predators through the void between worlds. For 300 years, no species had stood against them and survived. Their technology was superior, their tactics flawless, and their resolve absolute. The galaxy had learned to fear the sight of their angular vessels emerging from hyperspace, bringing with them the promise of conquest and subjugation. Admiral Zektar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Decimator, watching as his fleet prepared to enter the Sol system. The blue star ahead held 8 planets, and, according to their scouts, the third planet harbored a young civilization that had only recently achieved spaceflight. It would be another easy conquest, another world to add to their ever-growing empire. Admiral, called his tactical officer, Lieutenant Vexhal, we are receiving transmissions from the third planet. They appear to be attempting communication. Zektar's mandibles clicked in amusement. How quaint. What do these primitives have to say? The bridge speakers crackled to life with an alien voice speaking in what their translation systems identified as the dominant language of the planet. This is Earth Defense Command to unknown vessels. You are entering restricted space. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. The bridge crew erupted in chittering laughter. Earth Defense Command? These beings actually thought they could defend themselves against the might of the Carathian Empire. Zektar had seen this countless times before. Young civilizations, barely able to leave their home worlds, believing they could stand against forces beyond their comprehension. Open a channel, Zektar ordered, his voice carrying the authority of countless victories. Inhabitants of the third planet, I am Admiral Zektar of the Carathian Empire. You will surrender immediately and prepare for occupation. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your world. There was a pause before the human voice responded. Admiral Zektar, this is Admiral Sarah Chun of Earth Defense Command. We respectfully decline your demand for surrender. Earth is under the protection of the United Earth Alliance, and we will defend our home with everything we have. Zektar's amusement grew. The audacity of these creatures was almost refreshing. Most civilizations simply cowered and begged for mercy when faced with Carathian might. These humans at least had spirit, though it would do them no good. Very well, Zektar said, his tone growing cold. You have chosen death. We shall accommodate you. As his fleet moved deeper into the system, Zektar studied the tactical displays showing the disposition of human forces. They had a few dozen ships scattered throughout the system, primitive vessels barely capable of interplanetary travel. Their largest warship was less than half the size of his smallest frigate. This would be over in minutes. The humans had established defensive positions around their homeworld and its single natural satellite. Their ships were arranged in what their computers recognized as a classical defensive formation, though one that would prove utterly useless against Carathian firepower. Zektar almost felt sorry for them. Sir, Vexhal called out, we're detecting unusual energy signatures from the human vessels. Their power output seems inconsistent with their apparent technology level. Zektar dismissed the concern with a wave. Probably desperation measures. They're likely overloading their systems in a futile attempt to match our capabilities. Begin the attack. The Carathian fleet opened fire with devastating precision. Plasma beams and particle weapons lanced across space toward the human defensive line. Zektar watched with practiced attachment as the weapons struck their targets, expecting to see the familiar sight of enemy ships breaking apart under the assault. Instead, something impossible happened. The human ships absorbed the full force of the Carathian attack and remained intact. Blue energy fields flickered around their hulls for a moment before fading, and then the ships began to move. What? Zektar stared at his displays in disbelief. How are they still functional? Our weapons should have vaporized them. Sir, the tactical officer's voice was tight with confusion. Their ships appear to be equipped with some form of energy shielding. It's unlike anything in our databases. Before Zektar could respond, the human ships opened fire. Their weapons were unlike anything the Carathians had encountered before. Instead of the plasma or particle beams common throughout the galaxy, they fired solid projectiles at tremendous velocities. The kinetic rounds struck with devastating force, and something even more disturbing happened. The rounds passed straight through the Carathian shields as if they weren't there. Impossible! Zektar roared as he watched one of his destroyers take a direct hit to its engine section. The ship shuddered and began to list as secondary explosions rippled through its hull. Our shields should stop any physical projectile. His chief engineer, Commander Thexvar, was frantically working at his console. Admiral, their projectiles appear to be composed of some unknown material. Our shields are calibrated to deflect energy weapons and standard kinetic rounds, but these are passing through our defensive fields like they don't exist. The human fleet was advancing now, their movements coordinated with a precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. They fought like veterans, not the primitive Zektar had expected to face. Their ships weaved between Carathian fire with an agility that should have been impossible for vessels of their size. "Sir," Vexhal called out urgently, "we're receiving another transmission from the humans." "Put it through," Zektar growled, his earlier amusement replaced by growing concern. Admiral Chen's voice filled the bridge again, calm and professional despite the battle raging around them. "Admiral Zektar, you have the opportunity to withdraw your forces now. We have no desire for unnecessary bloodshed, but we will defend our home. You think you have one because you destroyed one ship?" Zektar snarled. "We have faced down entire armadas. You are nothing but an insignificant species that has barely learned to leave its cradle." "Admiral," Chen's voice carried a note of sadness, "we are not an insignificant species. And this is not our cradle. This is our fortress." The words sent a chill down Zektar's spine, though he couldn't say why. There was something in the human's tone, a confidence that spoke of hidden knowledge. He pushed the feeling aside and focused on the battle. His fleet still vastly outnumbered the humans, and while their unconventional weapons and defenses were proving troublesome, Carathian superiority would ultimately prevail. It always had. "All ships, concentrate fire on their flagship," Zektar ordered. "If we can eliminate their command vessel, their coordination will collapse." The Carathian fleet focused its assault on the largest human ship, a vessel the humans had designated as UES Indomitable. The combined firepower of 50 warships struck the human flagship simultaneously, enough energy to crack a small moon. The human ship's shields flared brighter than a star for a moment, then stabilized. When the light faded, the Indomitable was not only intact, but was returning fire with weapons that defied explanation. The ship launched what appeared to be small craft, but as they approached the Carathian fleet, they revealed their true nature. They were missiles, but not like any missiles in the Carathian arsenal. These weapons moved with impossible speed and agility, weaving through defensive fire as if guided by prescient intelligence. When they struck their targets, the explosions were unlike anything Zektar had ever seen. The missiles didn't simply explode. They seemed to consume the matter around them, creating expanding spheres of annihilation that devoured everything in their path. 3 Carathian cruisers simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only empty space and the echo of their death screams on the communication channels. What were those weapons?" Zektar whispered, staring at the empty space where his ships had been moments before. "Unknown, sir," Thexvar reported, his voice shaking. "The energy signatures are completely outside our understanding. It's as if they're manipulating matter at a fundamental level." The human fleet was pressing their advantage now, their unconventional weapons carving through the Carathian formation with surgical precision. Each shot was perfectly placed, targeting critical systems and weak points with an accuracy that spoke of intimate knowledge of Carathian ship design. "How do they know where to hit us?" Vexhal asked, voicing the question that was plaguing them all. "They shouldn't know anything about our technology." Zektar was beginning to suspect that his assumptions about these humans had been terribly, catastrophically wrong. The evidence was mounting that this was not a primitive species stumbling into their first interstellar conflict. The coordination, the advanced technology, the tactical awareness, it all pointed to something far more dangerous. "Sir," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving transmissions from the outer system. Something massive is approaching from beyond the asteroid belt." The tactical display updated to show new contacts emerging from the darkness between worlds. Zektar felt his blood freeze as he took in what his sensors were telling him. Ships, hundreds of them, all human. But these were not the small defensive vessels they had been fighting. These were massive warships, each one larger than his flagship. They moved in perfect formation, their approach timed to coincide with the moment when his fleet was most vulnerable. "Admiral Chun," Zektar said, opening a channel to the human commander, "what is the meaning of this? Where did these ships come from?" "Admiral," Chun replied, and now there was something almost gentle in her voice. "I tried to warn you. Earth is not our cradle. It's our fortress. And you just triggered our planetary defense protocols." As the massive human fleet drew closer, Zektar could see details that made his worst fears reality. These ships bore the scars of countless battles. Their hulls were marked with the symbols of victories against species he recognized: the vegan hegemony, the Crystal Collective, the machine lords of Andromeda. All civilizations that had vanished from galactic records centuries ago, their fates unknown. Now he knew what had happened to them. "Impossible," he breathed. "The humans have only just achieved spaceflight. Our scouts confirmed it. Your species is barely 300 years old." Chin's laughter was not cruel, but it was knowing. "Admiral, your scouts saw exactly what we wanted them to see. Humanity has been among the stars for over 2,000 years. We learned long ago that the galaxy is a dangerous place, full of species who believe might makes right." The implications hit Zektar like a physical blow. If the humans had been spacefaring for 2 millennia, if they had been observing the Carathian Empire all this time, how many other species were out there, watching, waiting, hiding their true capabilities until threatened? "We developed a simple policy," Chun continued as her massive fleet moved into attack formation. "Leave us alone, and we'll leave you alone. But threaten our home, threaten our people, and you'll discover why the vegan hegemony called us the Void Devils. Why the Crystal Collective designated us as a Class 12 extinction threat. Why the Machine Lords, with all their computational power and predictive algorithms, simply left the galaxy rather than face us again." Zektar looked around his bridge at his officers, seeing his own dawning horror reflected in their faces. The Carathian Empire had built its reputation on being the apex predators of the galaxy. They had conquered 17 star systems because no one could stand against them. But they had never faced humanity at full strength. "Admiral," Chen's voice was calm, professional, and utterly implacable. "You have one last chance. Withdraw your forces now, leave this system, and never return. Forget you ever found us. In return, we'll forget this ever happened." Zektar's pride warred with his growing understanding of the situation. The Carathian way was never to retreat, never to show weakness. But the Carathian way had never encountered anything like this. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll join the others," Chun replied simply. "The ones who thought they were unstoppable." The massive human ships were close enough, now that their weapons were coming online. Zektar could see energy signatures building, weapons systems that made even his flagship's armaments look primitive. But more than that, he could feel something else, a presence, as if the ships themselves were alive and watching him with ancient, patient eyes. "Sir," Vexhal whispered urgently, "orders?" Zektar stared at the tactical display, at the overwhelming force arrayed against his fleet, at the evidence of human capabilities that stretched back millennia. The smart choice was obvious. The Carathian choice was not. "Admiral Chun," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his hearts. "The Carathian Empire does not retreat." There was a long pause before Chun responded, and when she did, Her voice carried a weight of sadness that seemed to encompass ages. "I was afraid you'd say that. I am sorry, Admiral. You seem like an honorable being. I wish we could have met under different circumstances." "As do I," Zektar replied, and found that he meant it. The human fleet opened fire. The weapons that lanced across space toward the Carathian formation were unlike anything in Zektar's experience. They bent reality around them, turning space itself into a weapon. Some of his ships simply folded in on themselves, compressed into impossibly small points before vanishing entirely. Others aged centuries in seconds, their hulls corroding and their crews dying of old age in moments. The Decimator shuddered as something passed through its shields as if they were empty space. Zektar felt reality twist around him, felt time itself become fluid and strange. His last coherent thought was a wondering admiration for beings who had mastered forces that the Carathian Empire hadn't even known existed. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted exactly 37 seconds. When it was over, Admiral Sarachun stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, looking at the empty space where the Carathian fleet had been. Around her, the defensive fleet was already returning to their hidden positions throughout the system, while the heavy battle fleet prepared to fade back into the darkness beyond the outer planets. "Think any of them got a message out?" asked her tactical officer, Commander Rodriguez. "Probably," Chin replied with a shrug. "It doesn't matter. By the time anyone comes to investigate, we'll be just a primitive species that barely knows how to leave its home planet again." "Seems almost cruel," Rodriguez observed. They had no idea what they were walking into. Chin nodded slowly. "The Carathians aren't evil, just aggressive. They're predators, but they follow a code. If they'd accepted the offer to withdraw..." She sighed. "But they didn't. And now their empire will spend the next few centuries wondering what happened to Admiral Zektar and his fleet. Until they try again." "They won't," Chun said with quiet certainty. "Word will spread. There will be theories, legends, ghost stories. The Outer Rim species will whisper about the system where an entire Carathian fleet simply vanished. They'll make up explanations. Ancient automated defenses, spatial anomalies, interdimensional predators. Anything but the truth. Anything but the truth," she agreed. "That a species exists that learned to hide among the stars, that watches and waits, that has turned survival into an art form. A species that discovered long ago that the best way to win a war is to make sure your enemies never know you're fighting one." As the last of the human ships disappeared into the void, Earth continued its slow rotation, a blue and green world orbiting a yellow star, home to a species that had only recently learned to reach for the stars. Or so it appeared to anyone watching from a distance. The truth, as always, was far more complex and far more dangerous than any observer could possibly imagine. 3 months had passed since the Carathian fleet vanished without a trace in the Sol system, and the ripples of that disappearance were spreading throughout the galaxy like cracks in glass. High Magistrate Veltharion of the Carathian High Council stood before the great viewing portal of the orbital command station above Carathia Prime, staring out at the stars that had once seemed so welcoming, so full of worlds ripe for conquest. Now those same stars seemed to harbor secrets that chilled him to his core. "Still no word from Admiral Zektar?" he asked without turning from the viewport. Behind him, Intelligence Director Kexmore shuffled through his data tablets, the sound of his claws on metal the only noise in the cavernous chamber. "Nothing, High Magistrate. The last transmission we received was his confirmation that he had entered the Sol system. After that," he gestured helplessly. Silence. Veltharion's mandibles clicked in frustration. In 3 centuries of expansion, the Carathian Empire had never lost an entire fleet. Ships might be damaged, occasionally destroyed in particularly fierce resistance, but a complete disappearance? It was unprecedented. "What do we know about this human species?" Veltharion asked, finally, turning from the viewport to face his intelligence chief. "Very little," Kexmore admitted, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Our long-range scouts identified them as a recently spacefaring species. They achieved their first interplanetary flight approximately 300 years ago, their first interstellar capability only 50 years past. By all metrics, this should have posed no threat to Admiral Zektar's fleet. And yet an entire battle group has vanished, Veltharion said grimly. 50 ships, 50,000 of our finest warriors, gone without even a distress signal. The implications were staggering. The Carathian Empire's expansion had been built on the principle of overwhelming force applied swiftly and decisively. They identified primitive civilizations, conquered them before they could develop adequate defenses, and moved on to the next target. It was a strategy that had worked flawlessly for 3 centuries. Have we attempted to contact other powers about this system? Veltharion asked. Yes, High Magistrate, Kexmore replied, consulting his tablets. That's where things become interesting. None of the major powers have any records of contact with this human species. The hegemony, the collective, even the machine lords, none of them have ever encountered these beings. That's not possible, Veltharion said flatly. A spacefaring species can't remain hidden for 50 years. There are trade routes, exploration missions, colonial expansion. Someone would have made contact. That's what logic would suggest, Kexmore agreed. But the evidence doesn't support it. Either these humans have remained completely isolated in their single system for half a century, or what? Or someone is lying to us. The words hung in the air like a poison cloud. The idea that other galactic powers might be concealing information about a potential threat was almost as disturbing as the loss of the fleet itself. It suggested conspiracies and hidden alliances that could threaten the very foundation of Carathian dominance. I want another expedition prepared, Veltharion decided. A larger one this time. If these humans have some unknown defensive capability, we'll overwhelm it with sheer numbers. High Magistrate, Kexmore said carefully, might I suggest a different approach? Perhaps we should attempt diplomatic contact first, try to determine what happened to Admiral Zektar's fleet before committing more resources. Veltharion's eyes blazed with cold fire. The Carathian Empire does not negotiate with species that attack our fleets. We respond with strength. But we don't know that they attacked, Kexmore protested. There could be any number of explanations. Spatial anomalies, automated defense systems left by a previous civilization, natural phenomena we haven't encountered before. Then, we'll discover the truth by force, Veltharion said with finality. Prepare the second fleet. Admiral Drexon will lead the expedition with 200 ships. Whatever destroyed Admiral Zektar will not stand against such overwhelming power. While the Carathian Empire mobilized for what they believed would be a decisive show of force, observers throughout the galaxy watched with interest that ranged from scientific curiosity to predatory anticipation. In the crystal spires of the vegan hegemony, ancient beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations exchanged knowing looks. Empress Zarathil, her crystalline form refracting the light of her homeworld's twin suns into prismatic rainbows, received the news of Carathian preparations with something that might have been amusement if her species were capable of such emotions. They're actually going back, observed her chief advisor, Nexzilith, his own crystal matrix pulsing with colors that indicated surprise. After losing an entire fleet, they're sending an even larger force. Of course they are, Zarathil replied, her mental voice carrying harmonics of certainty. The Carathians have never encountered a setback they couldn't overcome with superior numbers. It served them well against the younger species. Should we warn them? Warn them of what? Zarathil's crystalline laughter sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. That some species are older than they appear? That the galaxy holds secrets they've never imagined? They wouldn't believe us even if we tried. In the depths of space, where the machine lords maintained their vast computational networks, artificial intelligences that had existed since the dawn of galactic civilization processed the same information with cold mechanical precision. Their probability matrices had already calculated the outcome of a second Carathian expedition to the Sol system. And The results were as predictable as the orbit of planets around stars. The machines remembered the humans. They remembered the war that had ended not in victory or defeat, but in mutual recognition of a simple truth. Some conflicts had no winners, only survivors. The machine lords had made their choice and departed for distant galaxies, leaving behind only automated warnings buried deep in databases that few species ever accessed. The Carathians, it seemed, were not among those few. Admiral Drexhan was everything that Admiral Zektar had been and more. Where Zektar had been a competent fleet commander with a distinguished service record, Drexhan was a legend. He had personally led the conquests of 7-star systems, broken the resistance of species that had fought with the fury of the desperate, and never lost a single engagement in 40 years of warfare. His flagship, the Annihilator, was the pride of the Carathian fleet. Nearly twice the size of Zektar's Decimator, it carried enough firepower to reduce a planet's surface to molten slag. Around it, 200 of the Empire's finest warships formed up in perfect battle formation, their dark hulls gleaming with the malevolent beauty of purpose-built instruments of war. Admiral, his tactical officer, reported as the fleet prepared to enter hyperspace. All ships report ready for departure. Excellent, Drexhan said, his voice carrying the confidence of absolute certainty. Whatever happened to Admiral Zektar, we'll discover the truth and respond accordingly. The reputation of the Carathian Empire will not be tarnished by mysterious disappearances. The Second Fleet entered hyperspace with a confidence born of 3 centuries of unbroken victory. They had no way of knowing that their departure was observed by hidden sensors scattered throughout Carathian space, sensors that have been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. In a facility hidden beneath the surface of Earth's moon, Admiral Chin stood before a tactical display that showed the approaching Carathian force in perfect detail. Around her, the command center hummed with quiet activity as her staff prepared for what was about to unfold. Second Fleet is larger than expected, observed Commander Martinez, Chin's intelligence chief. 200 ships instead of the projected 150. They're learning, Chin replied with something that might have been approval. Pity they're not learning the right lessons. Orders, Admiral? Chun considered for a moment, watching the display that showed not just the Carathian fleet, but the positions of human forces throughout the sector. Ships that appeared to be civilian freighters powered up weapons systems that had never appeared on any galactic registry. Space stations that registered as mining platforms revealed their true nature as heavily armed battle stations. What had seemed like a sparsely defended system transformed before their eyes into a fortress of unimaginable strength. Standard response protocol, Chin decided. The one warning, then, we implement Lazarus 7. Lazarus 7? Martinez raised an eyebrow. That's comprehensive. They brought 200 ships, Commander. They obviously didn't get the message the first time. This time, we'll make sure they understand exactly what they're dealing with. The Carathian Second Fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system with all the confidence of predators arriving at what they expected to be a feeding ground. Admiral Drexhan stood on his bridge, studying the tactical displays with the eye of an experienced hunter. Same as before, his tactical officer reported. A few dozen primitive vessels in defensive positions around the third planet. No sign of what happened to Admiral Zektar's fleet. Scan for debris fields, Drexhan ordered. If there was a battle here, there should be some evidence. The scans revealed nothing. No wreckage, no energy signatures, no trace that 50 Carathian warships had ever existed. It was as if Admiral Zektar's fleet had simply vanished from reality itself. Sir, the communications officer called out, we're being hailed by the planet. Put it through, Drexhan said, his voice cold with controlled anger. The same voice that had spoken to Admiral Zektar 3 months earlier filled the bridge. This is Admiral Sarachun of Earth Defense Command. Admiral Drexhan, I presume. You presume correctly, Drexhan plead. I want to know what happened to Admiral Zektar and his fleet. Admiral Zektar was given the opportunity to withdraw, Chen replied calmly. He chose to attack instead. He and his fleet are dead. The stark simplicity of the statement sent a chill through the bridge crew. There was no boasting, no triumph in the human's voice. She spoke of the destruction of 50 Carathian warships with the casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. Impossible, Drexansnalit. No primitive species has the capability to destroy a Carathian battle fleet. Admiral, Chen's voice carried a note of patient explanation. Your people have a saying. The predator that hunts in darkness sees only shadows until the light reveals the true nature of its prey. You're hunting in darkness, Admiral. Would you like us to turn on the lights? Before Drexhan could respond, the tactical displays exploded with new contacts. Ships materialized out of empty space as if they had been hiding in the void itself. Not dozens this time, but thousands. Massive battle cruisers that dwarfed even the Annihilator. Sleek destroyers that moved with impossible grace. And something else, something that made Drexhan's blood freeze in his veins. Space itself was moving. What in the name of the void is that? He whispered, staring at the display. What he was seeing defied every law of physics he understood. Sections of space were folding in on themselves, revealing structures that had been hidden in dimensions his species had never imagined existed. Cities. Entire cities floating in the void, their lights stretching across distances measured in astronomical units. Those are our orbital habitats, Chen explained, her voice still maddeningly calm. We've been building them for the better part of 2 millennia. Would you like to know how many people live in them? Drexhan's tactical computers were trying to process the information and failing. The numbers were too large, the energy signatures too complex. Conservative estimates suggested that the human population in space alone numbered in the hundreds of billions. This is impossible, he breathed. Our scouts reported a single planet with a few billion inhabitants. You're supposed to be a young species. Your scouts saw exactly what we wanted them to see, Chen replied. We've been watching your empire for 300 years, Admiral. We know everything about you. Your military capabilities, your expansion patterns, your weaknesses. We've been preparing for this conversation for centuries. But why? Drexhan asked, his strategic mind racing to understand the implications. Why hide? With this level of technology, you could have conquered half the galaxy. Because conquest creates enemies, Chen explained patiently. And enemies create wars. And wars create suffering. We learned long ago that it's better to remain hidden, to watch and wait, to only reveal ourselves when threatened directly. Like now, she agreed. Around the Second Fleet, the massive human armada was taking position with mechanical precision. Ships that had been hidden throughout the system converged from every direction, their movements coordinated by a level of tactical intelligence that exceeded anything in Carathian experience. Admiral, Drexhan's communications officer said urgently, we're receiving a message from the High Council. They're ordering us to withdraw immediately. Drexhan frovnid. What? Why would they? His blood chilled as understanding dawned. They're monitoring this transmission. The entire galaxy is monitoring this transmission, Chen confirmed. We're broadcasting on all major communication networks. Every spacefaring species in this sector is watching to see what happens next. You're making an example of us. We're making a point, Chen corrected. The same point we've made to every aggressive species we've encountered over the past 2 millennia. Leave us alone, and we'll leave you alone. Threaten us, and discover why entire civilizations have vanished from galactic records. The implications hit Drexhan like a physical blow. The vegan hegemony, the Crystal Collective, the Machine Lords, all the great powers that had mysteriously withdrawn from galactic politics over the centuries. They hadn't left voluntarily. They'd been made to leave. Admiral Chun, he said carefully, what exactly are you? We're survivors, Admiral, she replied. We're what happens when a species decides that the only way to ensure peace is to become too dangerous to threaten. We're what happens when a civilization chooses to become the thing that makes monsters check under their beds at night. The human fleet was fully deployed now, thousands of ships forming a three-dimensional formation that surrounded the Carathian force completely. But, more than that, Drexhan could see weapons systems that seemed to bend reality itself, energy signatures that his computers couldn't even classify. "You have a choice, Admiral," Chen said. "The same choice we gave Admiral Zektar. Withdraw now, leave this system, and never return. Forget you ever found us. In return, we'll maintain the fiction that humanity is a young, primitive species that poses no threat to anyone. And if I refuse, then you'll join Admiral Zektar," Chen said simply. "And the Carathian Empire will send a third fleet, and then a fourth, until eventually someone in your government realizes that some fights can't be won." Drexhan looked around his bridge at his officers, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. Everything they thought they knew about the galaxy had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. The humans weren't primitive. They were ancient. They weren't weak. They were terrifyingly powerful, and they were offering him a way out. "The Empire doesn't retreat," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I know," Chen replied, and there was genuine sadness in her voice. "Goodbye, Admiral." The last thing Admiral Drexhan saw was a flash of light that seemed to encompass the entire universe, as forces beyond his understanding reached out and gently erased the second fleet from existence. When it was over, the human ships faded back into the darkness from which they had emerged, and the Sol system returned to its peaceful appearance of a single star with 8 planets, one of which harbored a young species that had only recently learned to reach for the stars. The transmission ended, but its echoes would ripple through the galaxy for centuries to come. The emergency session of the Galactic Trade Federation had been called within hours of the second Carathian fleet's disappearance. In the vast amphitheater that orbited the neutral world of Kepler, 438b, representatives from dozens of species gathered in a setting that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations over the millennia. Ambassador Thrix of the Altarian Republic stepped forward to address the assembly, her 6 limbs moving in the ritualistic gestures that preceded formal proceedings. Around her, beings of every conceivable form watched with an attention that bordered on desperate urgency. "Honored colleagues," she began, her translator rendering her words into 100 different languages simultaneously. "We have gathered to discuss a matter that threatens the stability of our entire galactic community. The Carathian Empire has lost not one, but 2 complete battle fleets to an unknown force in the Sol system." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled delegates. The Carathians have been a known quantity for centuries, aggressive, expansionist, but predictable. Their sudden vulnerability to an unknown threat had implications that extended far beyond their borders. "What do we know about this human species?" asked Ambassador Krell of the vegan hegemony, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into patterns of inquiry. "Very little," Thrix admitted. "They appear to have achieved spaceflight approximately 3 centuries ago, but there are inconsistencies in the data." She gestured, and a holographic display filled the center of the amphitheater. Star charts, sensor readings, and intelligence reports floated in 3-dimensional space, painting a picture that became more confusing the more details were examined. "Our long-range surveys identified a single inhabited planet with a population of approximately 8 billion beings," she continued. "Primitive technology, early industrial development, no apparent threat to galactic stability. Yet they've destroyed 500 of the most advanced warships in known space," observed Ambassador Vol of the Regellian Consortium, his tentacles writhing with barely controlled agitation. "This doesn't add up." "No," Thrix agreed grimly. "It doesn't. Which brings us to the real question we must address today. Who else is in contact with these humans?" The silence that followed was deafening. In a chamber where dozens of species were represented, where trade agreements and territorial disputes were discussed with passionate intensity, the absolute quiet spoke volumes. "I see," Thrix said finally. "So either this species has remained completely isolated for 3 centuries, which strains credibility, or some of us have been less than forthcoming about our encounters with them. Ambassador Krell's crystalline matrix pulsed with colors that indicated careful consideration. The vegan hegemony was older than most of the civilizations represented in this chamber. Their memories stretched back across eons, and they had seen the rise and fall of countless empires. Perhaps, he said slowly, the question is not who has encountered them, but who has survived the encounter. The implications of his words sent a chill through the assembly. The idea that a species might be systematically eliminating other civilizations was terrifying enough, but the possibility that they had been doing so for centuries without detection was almost unthinkable. Are you suggesting, Ambassador Vol asked carefully, that other missing civilizations might have fallen victim to these humans? I'm suggesting, Krell replied, that we may be looking at this from the wrong perspective. We assume the humans are a young species, because that's what our surveys tell us. But what if our surveys are wrong? What if they're seeing exactly what the humans want them to see? The holographic display shifted, showing a timeline of galactic history stretching back 2 millennia. Points of light appeared and disappeared, marking the rise and fall of various civilizations. A pattern emerged as the delegates studied the data, a pattern that none of them wanted to acknowledge. The Andromedan Collective, Thrix said quietly, highlighting a cluster of stars that had gone dark 500 years earlier. Advanced species, powerful technology. They simply stopped communicating one day. The Silicon Syndicate, added Ambassador Vol, pointing to another region, disappeared 800 years ago. No distres signals, no explanation. The Iron Dominion, the Ethereal Empire, the Quantum Commonwealth. Krell continued the list with inexorable precision. All gone. All vanished without a trace over the past 2 millennia. The pattern was undeniable. Every few centuries, one of the galaxy's major powers would simply cease to exist. No wars, no invasions, no gradual decline. They were there one day and gone the next, leaving behind only empty space and unanswered questions. You think the humans did this? Ambassador Vol asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I think, Krell replied, that we need to consider the possibility that we've been sharing the galaxy with apex predators for 2,000 years, and we're only now beginning to understand what that means. In the depths of space, far from the political maneuvering of the Galactic Trade Federation, High Magistrate Veltharion stood before the assembled Carathian High Council in their underground bunkers beneath the capital city. The loss of 2 fleets had shaken the Empire to its core, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The 3rd Fleet is assembling, reported Admiral Nexus, the Empire's senior military commander. 500 ships, including our newest dreadnoughts. Whatever destroyed the previous expeditions won't stand against such overwhelming force. And if it does, asked Counselor Zephyra, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. We've lost 700 ships and some of our finest officers to this threat. Perhaps it's time to consider alternatives to direct military action. The Carathian Empire does not negotiate from a position of weakness, Veltharion declared, his voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of conquest. We've built our reputation on strength, on the certainty that no force in the galaxy can stand against us. If we show weakness now, every subject species will see it as an opportunity for rebellion. What if we're not the apex predators we thought we were? Zephyra asked quietly. What if there's something out there that sees us the way we see the primitive species we've conquered? The question hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. The entire foundation of Carathian society was built on the principle of strength through conquest. They were the wolves in a galaxy of sheep, the predators that lesser species feared and obeyed. The possibility that they might, in turn, be prey to something even more dangerous was almost too terrifying to contemplate. Impossible, Admiral Nexus said, but his voice lacked conviction. We've surveyed the galaxy for centuries. We know every major power, every potential threat. There's nothing out there that could challenge the full might of the Empire. Then, explain the disappearances, Zephyra challenged. Explain how 2 complete fleets vanished without a trace. Explain how a primitive species managed to destroy 700 of our finest ships. The chamber fell silent as the assembled counselors contemplated questions that had no comfortable answers. In their entire history as a spacefaring species, the Carathians had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with superior firepower. It was a philosophy that had served them well across 17-star systems and countless conquered worlds. Now, for the first time, they were facing the possibility that firepower might not be enough. Meanwhile, in a facility hidden in the asteroid belt of the Sol system, Admiral Chen stood before a gathering of humanity's senior military commanders. Unlike the political posturing happening elsewhere in the galaxy, this was a meeting of soldiers discussing the practical realities of an escalating conflict. Third Fleet is massing, reported General Harrison, head of Solar System Defense. 500 ships this time. They're escalating faster than our models predicted. They're scared, observed Admiral Okafor, commander of the Deep Space Fleet. Scared species make dangerous decisions. They might decide that their only option is to keep throwing fleets at us until something breaks. Chen nodded grimly. The Carathians were following a pattern that humanity had seen before. When faced with an inexplicable defeat, aggressive species typically responded with escalating force until they either achieved victory or exhausted their resources. It was a predictable reaction, but one that could lead to unnecessary bloodshed. What's our intelligence on their total military capacity? Chen asked. Current estimates put their total fleet strength at approximately 15,000 ships, replied Commander Torres from Naval Intelligence. They could theoretically keep sending larger fleets for years before running out of vessels. And they probably will, Chun said with resignation. The Carathian culture doesn't allow for strategic retreat. They'll keep escalating until they either win or destroy themselves trying. Recommendations? Asked Admiral Martinez. Chen was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical displays that showed human forces throughout the galaxy. Ships disguised as traders moved along established shipping routes. Research stations masqueraded as commercial mining operations. Even now, after revealing their true nature to the Carathians, the vast majority of humanity's presence in the galaxy remained hidden. We implement Protocol Omega, she decided finally. It's time to end this before it spirals out of control. The room fell silent. Protocol Omega was humanity's ultimate deterrent, a demonstration so overwhelming that it would remove any doubt about their capabilities. It hadn't been used in over 800 years, not since the Machine Lords had tested human resolve and learned the hard way why some doors should never be opened. Admiral, General Harrison said carefully, Protocol Omega will reveal capabilities that we've kept hidden for centuries. Once that cat's out of the bag, it's better than the alternative, Chen replied. If we let this continue, the Carathians will keep sending fleets until they exhaust their resources or stumble onto something they're not prepared for. Either outcome destabilizes the galactic balance we've spent 2 millennia maintaining. Orders, Admiral? Send a message to Carathian High Command, Chun said. Full spectrum broadcast, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Tell them that Admiral Sarah Chun, Supreme Commander of the Human Defense Fleet, requests a meeting with High Magistrate Veltharian. 1 representative from each side, neutral ground, protected by diplomatic immunity. And if they refuse, then we show them why every major power in galactic history has eventually learned to leave us alone, Chun said grimly. One way or another. The message reached Carathian space within hours, transmitted on frequencies that penetrated every communication network in the Empire. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss as a hoax or misinformation. The source codes identified it as coming from deep within the Sol system, from a transmission array powerful enough to reach across interstellar distances with perfect clarity. High Magistrate Veltharian, read the message 3 times before its full implications sank in. Supreme Commander of the Human Defense Fleet, not Earth Defense Command, as they have been calling themselves. the Human Defense Fleet. The title suggested a military organization that extended far beyond a single planet, far beyond what their intelligence reports had indicated was possible. "What do we know about this Sarah-chan?" he asked his intelligence chief. "Nothing," Kexmore admitted. "The name doesn't appear in any of our databases. She could be their supreme military commander, or she could be a low-ranking officer they're using as a spokesman. We have no way to verify her authority. But she knows our protocols," Veltharian observed. "Diplomatic immunity, neutral ground, single representatives. Those are Korathian negotiation standards. How would a primitive species know our formal procedures?" The question hung in the air, another piece of evidence that the humans were far more than they appeared. Either they had been studying Korathian culture for years, or they had experience with galactic diplomacy that contradicted everything the Empire believed about them. "Sir," asked Admiral Nexus, "orders regarding the Third Fleet?" Veltharian considered his options. Military pride demanded that he refuse the meeting, that he demonstrate Korathian strength by crushing whatever force had destroyed the previous expeditions. Political wisdom suggested that he at least hear what these humans had to say before committing more resources to a conflict he didn't understand. In the end, pragmatism won out over pride. "Recall the Third Fleet," he ordered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Inform Admiral Chun that I'll meet with her at the coordinates she specified." "Sir," Admiral Nexus looked stunned. "We're negotiating with the species that destroyed 2 of our fleets." "We're gathering intelligence," Veltharian corrected coldly. "If these humans have capabilities we don't understand, we need to learn about them before we commit more ships to an engagement we might not be able to win." The meeting was scheduled to take place on Kepler 442b, a neutral world maintained by the Galactic Trade Federation for exactly such purposes. It was a barren planet with a thin atmosphere, chosen specifically because it offered no strategic advantages to any species. The surface was monitored by automated systems that would record everything that transpired, ensuring that both sides would be held accountable for their words and actions. When Veltharian's shuttle touched down at the designated coordinates, he was surprised to see that the humans had already arrived. A single small craft sat on the landing pad, unremarkable except for its complete lack of visible weapons or defensive systems. It looked more like a civilian transport than a military vessel. Admiral Chun was waiting for him outside the meeting facility, a simple prefabricated structure that had been erected for this specific purpose. She was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder, with the kind of casual confidence that spoke of absolute certainty in her own capabilities. "High Magistrate Veltharian," she said as he approached, inclining her head in a gesture that managed to be respectful without being subservient. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Admiral Chun," he replied, studying her with the eye of a predator evaluating potential prey. She showed no signs of fear, no deference to his superior size and strength. If anything, she seemed almost relaxed. "I admit to curiosity about what you have to say. Let's go inside," she suggested. "What we're going to discuss requires privacy." The interior of the meeting facility was stark and functional, containing only a simple table and 2 chairs. Veltharian took his seat across from the human admiral, his mind racing with questions about what he was about to learn. "Before we begin," Chun said, placing a small device on the table between them, "I want you to understand something. This conversation is going to change everything you believe about the galaxy you live in. Once you hear what I'm about to tell you, there will be no going back to the comfortable certainties you've built your empire on." "I'm listening," Veltharian said, though a part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear what she had to say. "Good," Chun replied, activating the device. "Let's start with a question. How many spacefaring civilizations do you think have existed in this galaxy over the past 10,000 years? The question seemed innocuous enough, but something in her tone suggested that the answer was far more complex than it appeared. "Several hundred," Veltharian replied. "Perhaps 1,000, counting the minor powers and failed colonies." "Try 10,000, Chun said quietly. "At least 10,000. Probably more. Impossible." We have records going back millennia. We would know if there had been so many civilizations. You have records of the civilizations that survived long enough to be recorded, Chun corrected. You don't have records of the ones that were removed before they could become a threat. Removed by whom? Veltharion asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. By species like mine, Chun replied. By the ones who learned early that the galaxy is a dangerous place, and the only way to survive is to make sure that dangerous species don't survive long enough to become a threat. You're saying you've been systematically exterminating civilizations for thousands of years. Not exterminating, Chin said carefully. Removing. There's a difference. When a species becomes too aggressive, too expansionist, too dangerous to the galactic balance, they receive a warning. If they heed the warning, they're allowed to exist peacefully. If they don't, she gestured to the device on the table, and suddenly the room was filled with holographic images. Star charts showing the locations of vanished civilizations. Tactical analyses of long-dead empires. Archaeological evidence of species that had reached for the stars and found only darkness. The Andromedan Collective, she said, highlighting one cluster of stars. They believed they were destined to rule the galaxy. They were convinced that their technology made them invincible. They received 3 warnings before we acted. The Silicon Syndicate. They thought silicon-based life was inherently superior to carbon-based life. They began systematically exterminating organic species. They received 1 warning. The Iron Dominion. They discovered how to convert matter into energy and decided to remake the galaxy in their image. They received no warning at all. Veltharion stared at the displays, his mind reeling as the implications sank in. Every vanished civilization, every mysterious disappearance, every unexplained gap in galactic history, all of it orchestrated by beings who had hidden among the stars for millennia, watching and judging and acting when they deemed it necessary. Why? He asked finally. Why reveal this to me? Why tell me what you've done? Because, High Magistrate, Chin said, and her voice carried a weight of sadness that seemed to encompass ages. Your species stands at a crossroads. You can choose to step back from the path of endless conquest, to find your place in a galaxy that's larger and more dangerous than you ever imagined. Or you can continue as you have been and join the archaeological record of species that thought they were unstoppable. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him want to look away. The choice, as always, is yours. The silence in the meeting facility stretched for long minutes as High Magistrate Veltharion processed the implications of what Admiral Chun had revealed. Around them, the holographic displays continued to show the evidence of 10,000 years of hidden manipulation, of civilizations that had risen to greatness only to vanish when they pushed too far into dangerous territory. You expect me to believe, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, that my species, with all our technological advancement and military might, is nothing more than another entry waiting to be added to your archaeological database? I expect you to understand, Chin replied calmly, that technological advancement and military might are relative concepts. Every species that disappeared from this galaxy thought they were at the pinnacle of achievement. The ethereal empire could manipulate matter at the quantum level. The machine lords had computational power that exceeded the processing capacity of entire star systems. The Crystal Collective existed partially outside normal spacetime. She gestured to the displays showing the remnants of these vanished civilizations. They all had one thing in common. They believed that their particular advantages made them invincible. And humanity? Veltharion asked, what makes you different? What gives you the right to decide which species lives and which dies? We don't decide who lives and dies, Chin said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice. We simply respond to threats. Species that choose to coexist peacefully, that find their place in the galactic community without attempting to dominate it, are left alone. It's only when a civilization decides that conquest and expansion are more important than stability that we take action. Your judges, Veltharion said with growing understanding. You've appointed yourselves as the arbiters of galactic civilization. We've accepted a responsibility that someone has to accept, Chen corrected. The galaxy is finite, magistrate. Resources are limited, habitable worlds are precious, and when aggressive species begin unlimited expansion, the result is inevitable conflict on a scale that destroys everything. She activated another set of displays, these showing mathematical models and projections that painted a grim picture of unchecked galactic expansion. We've run the calculations thousands of times over thousands of years. Every simulation ends the same way. Without some form of regulation, without some force that prevents unlimited aggression, the galaxy burns. Every world becomes a battlefield. Every species becomes either predator or prey, and eventually, everyone loses. So you became that force. We became that force, Chun agreed. Not because we wanted to, but because the alternative was unacceptable. Veltharion studied the projections, his strategic mind working through the implications. The mathematics were undeniable. Unlimited expansion in a finite space led inevitably to resource wars, territorial conflicts, and, ultimately, galactic devastation on a scale that would leave nothing but dead worlds and empty space. How do you choose? He asked quietly. How do you decide which species receives warnings and which receives immediate action? We watch, Chen said simply. We've been watching your species for 3 centuries, Magistrate. We know your expansion patterns, your military doctrine, your treatment of conquered populations. We know that you've built your empire on the principle that might makes right, and we know that you show no signs of moderating that philosophy. We're not barbarians, Veltharion protested. We bring order to chaotic systems. We provide stability through strength. You've conquered 17 star systems, Chen replied, calling up records that made Veltharion's blood run cold. How could the humans have such detailed information about Korathian military operations? In the process, you've enslaved 43 different species, stripped resources from hundreds of worlds, and established a pattern of expansion that shows no signs of voluntary limitation. That's civilization, Veltharion said, though the words felt hollow. The strong rule the weak. It's the natural order. The natural order, Chen repeated thoughtfully. An interesting concept. Tell me, Magistrate, what was the natural order like for the species you conquered? Did they agree that it was natural for them to be enslaved? The question hit harder than any physical blow. Veltharion had never seriously considered the perspective of conquered populations. They were resources to be managed, not beings whose opinions mattered. The idea that they might have their own concept of natural order, their own beliefs about justice and freedom, was not something Korathian culture encouraged. You're asking me to feel sympathy for primitives, he said. But, even to his own ears, the words lacked conviction. I'm asking you to recognize that primitive is another relative concept, Chen replied. Every species you've conquered was someone else's advanced civilization. Every world you've stripped of resources was someone's home. Every individual you've enslaved was someone's child, parent, friend. She activated another display, this one showing detailed records of Korathian conquest campaigns. Veltharion watched in growing discomfort as his empire's military actions were dissected with clinical precision, showing casualty figures, refugee populations, environmental damage, and cultural destruction. The Valerian Republic, Chun said, highlighting one particular campaign. Population of 12 billion. They had achieved interplanetary spaceflight and were working on their first interstellar vessels when your forces arrived. They attempted negotiation, offered tribute, proposed mutual trade agreements. Your response was orbital bombardment followed by ground invasion. They had strategic resources we needed, Veltharion said defensively, though the justification sounded weak even to him. They had resources you wanted, Chen corrected. There's a difference. Your empire has never faced genuine resource scarcity. Your expansion has always been driven by desire, not necessity. And that makes us evil. That makes you dangerous, Chen said quietly. A species that expands because it needs to is predictable. It will stop when its needs are met. A species that expands because it wants to is unlimited in its appetite. It will never voluntarily stop growing until it has consumed everything within reach. The truth of her words was undeniable, and it terrified him. The Carathian Empire had never set limits on its expansion because it had never encountered limits that couldn't be overcome with sufficient force. The idea that they were fundamentally flawed, that their entire civilization was built on principles that made them a galactic threat, was almost too much to process. "What are you offering?" he asked finally. "A choice," Chen replied. "The same choice we've offered to every aggressive species over the past 2 millennia. Step back from unlimited expansion. Find a sustainable level of development that doesn't threaten galactic stability. Learn to coexist with your neighbors instead of conquering them. And if we refuse, then you join the archaeological record," Chen said with finality. "Your ships will stop responding to communications. Your colonies will go silent. Your homeworld will be found empty, with no signs of violence or struggle. Future explorers will puzzle over what happened to the great Carathian Empire, just as current historians puzzle over the fate of the Andromedan Collective. You would commit genocide? We would prevent genocide," Chen corrected. "Your empire's expansion patterns indicate that you'll be at war with the vegan hegemony within 50 years. Your resource requirements will bring you into conflict with the Regelian Consortium within a century. Left unchecked, your expansion will trigger a galactic war that will kill trillions and destroy countless worlds." She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "We don't want to destroy your species, Magistrate. We want to save it. But we'll save on our terms, not yours. And those terms are complete withdrawal from all conquered territories," Chun said, and Veltharion felt his world crumble around him. "Release of all enslaved populations. Compensation for environmental damage. Limitation of your military to purely defensive forces. Acceptance of monitoring to ensure compliance. You're asking us to dismantle our entire civilization," Veltharion said, his voice hollow. "We're asking you to transform it," Chen replied. "The Carathian people have many admirable qualities. You're brilliant engineers, talented organizers, natural leaders. Those qualities don't disappear just because you stop conquering other species. Our entire culture is built around expansion and dominance. Without conquest, what are we? You're whatever you choose to become," Chen said simply. "But you have to make that choice willingly. We can't force a species to change its fundamental nature. We can only remove species that refuse to change when their nature becomes a threat to galactic stability." Veltharion sat in silence for a long time, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd learned. Everything he believed about his species' place in the galaxy had been shattered. The Carathians weren't the apex predators they thought they were. They were prey, being evaluated by hunters so skilled that their targets never even knew they were being watched. "How long do we have?" he asked finally. "As long as you need," Chen replied. "But understand that we'll be watching. Any attempt to continue expansion, any attack on other species, any sign that you're not taking this seriously, and the conversation ends. And if we comply, if we accept your terms and transform our civilization as you described, then you join the community of species that have learned to coexist peacefully," Chen said. "You get to continue existing, continue developing, continue growing as a people. You just do it without threatening everyone around you. What about the other species? The ones who know we've been neutralized? They'll see us as weak, vulnerable to attack." Chun smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Magistrate, do you really think you're the only species we've had this conversation with?" The implications hit him like a physical blow. The vegan hegemony, the Regelian Consortium, the Altarian Republic, all the major powers in the galaxy. Had they all received similar ultimatums? Had they all been forced to moderate their expansion and limit their military capabilities? The current galactic balance isn't natural, he said with dawning understanding. It's artificial. You've been manipulating every major power for centuries. We've been maintaining stability, Chen corrected. The current era of relatively peaceful coexistence isn't an accident. It's the result of careful management over 2 millennia. And species that refuse to be managed cease to exist, Chen said simply. Always peacefully, always without violence, always in a way that leaves no trace of our involvement. But they cease to exist nonetheless. Veltharion felt a chill that went deeper than physical cold. The scope of human manipulation was staggering. They had been puppet masters pulling strings throughout the galaxy for 2,000 years, and no one had ever suspected. The major powers, the trade agreements, the territorial boundaries, all of it carefully orchestrated to maintain a balance that served human interests. You're not just judges, he said quietly. You're farmers, and we're all livestock. We're gardeners, Chen replied. And you're all plants that we're trying to keep from choking each other out. Some plants need more pruning than others, but the goal is always a healthy, sustainable garden. And if we refuse to be pruned, then you get composted, Chun said with brutal honesty. And we plant something else in your place. The meeting continued for several more hours as Chun provided detailed information about humanity's expectations and requirements. The specifics were staggering in scope. Complete military disarmament except for defensive forces. Withdrawal from all conquered territories within a standard galactic year. Reparations to displaced populations. Acceptance of monitoring stations throughout Corathian space. This isn't negotiation, Veltharion said as he reviewed the terms. This is surrender. This is survival, Chen corrected. You can view it as surrender if that makes it easier to accept, but what it really represents is evolution. Your species is being given the opportunity to grow beyond its current limitations. And if my government refuses these terms, then your government will cease to exist, Chun said with the same casual tone she might use to discuss the weather. Along with everyone who supports it, we're very good at identifying decision-makers and removing them from the equation. You would assassinate our leadership. We would facilitate a change in leadership, Chun said diplomatically. Sometimes that means supporting more reasonable elements within existing power structures. Sometimes it means encouraging revolution. And sometimes, she shrugged, sometimes it means starting over with a clean slate. Veltharion understood the implications. Humanity had the capability to eliminate not just ships and fleets, but specific individuals anywhere in the galaxy. The technology required for such precision was beyond anything the Corathian Empire had imagined possible. How, he asked. How do you do it? How do you eliminate entire civilizations without leaving any trace? Trade secret, Chun said with a slight smile. But I will tell you this much, it's not technology that gives us our advantage. It's perspective. We think in timescales that most species can't even comprehend. We plan for contingencies that others never consider. And we're willing to make sacrifices that others find unacceptable. What kind of sacrifices? The kind that ensure our children have a galaxy to inherit, Chen replied. The kind that prevent the endless wars and resource conflicts that would turn every world into a battlefield. The kind that preserve the possibility of civilization itself. As the meeting drew to a close, Veltharion found himself in a position he had never imagined possible. The proud High Magistrate of the Corathian Empire was essentially begging for his species' continued existence from a being who looked small and fragile, but commanded forces that could reshape the galaxy at will. I'll need to present this to the High Council, he said finally. Of course, Chen replied, standing and deactivating the holographic displays. You have 1 standard month to reach a decision. After that, we'll assume you've chosen the path of continued aggression and act accordingly. 1 month to transform a civilization that's existed for 3 centuries. 1 month to choose whether that civilization continues to exist at all. Chin corrected. The transformation can take longer, but the choice must be made immediately. As they prepared to leave the meeting facility, Veltharion had one final question. Why to me all of this? Why reveal your capabilities and methods? Wouldn't it be easier to simply eliminate us without explanation? Chin paused at the entrance, her hand on the door control. Because despite everything your species has done, we don't want to see you extinct. You have the potential to become something better than what you are. But that potential can only be realized if you understand exactly what you're choosing between. And if we choose wrong, then the galaxy moves on without you, Chin said quietly. And future species learn from your example why some choices can never be taken back. With that, she was gone, leaving Veltharion alone with the weight of his species' future pressing down on him like the gravity of a neutron star. The choice before the Carathian Empire was simple in its starkness: evolve or face extinction. As he made his way back to his shuttle, Veltharion realized that the galaxy he thought he knew had never existed at all. Behind the facade of competing powers and territorial disputes, behind the complex web of trade agreements and diplomatic negotiations, lay a simple truth that changed everything. Humanity had been in control all along. The question now was whether the Carathian Empire would be wise enough to accept that control or proud enough to die fighting against it. Either way, the choice would define not just the fate of a species, but the future of galactic civilization itself. The emergency session of the Carathian High Council had been in progress for 18 hours without a break. In the deep underground chambers beneath the capital city, the most powerful beings in the Empire debated the future of their civilization with a desperation none of them had ever experienced before. The weight of Admiral Chin's ultimatum hung over them like a storm cloud, impossible to ignore and terrifying in its implications. High Magistrate Veltharion stood before the assembled council, having recounted his conversation with the human admiral for the third time. Around him, the representatives of 17 conquered star systems struggled to process information that challenged every fundamental assumption about their place in the galaxy. "It's impossible," declared General Thexmore, head of the Empire's ground forces. "A primitive species cannot possibly have the capabilities this human claimed. Our intelligence reports are clear. They achieved spaceflight barely 3 centuries ago." "Our intelligence reports," Veltharion replied grimly, "told us exactly what the humans wanted them to tell us. According to Admiral Chun, they've been manipulating our surveys and reconnaissance missions for the entire duration of our expansion." "You're asking us to believe," said Counselor Nexar, her voice sharp with barely controlled anger, "that we've been puppets dancing to alien strings for 300 years? That every victory, every conquest, every expansion of our glorious empire has been permitted by these